For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Clause 2A, Paragraph 1 of Rule 9, I rise to give notice of my intention to offer a resolution to raise a question of the privileges of the House. The form of the resolution is as follows. Whereas although our nation's economy is gradually improving after one of the worst economic crises in our nation's history, the economic crisis remains a daily reality for the 13.3 million unemployed workers and for the millions of Americans experiencing record levels of food insecurity, poverty, and foreclosure. And whereas the national unemployment rate is 8.6%, with over 42.8% of all unemployed workers, more than 5.7 million people haven't been out of work for more than 6 months, and whereas while there were 1.8 unemployed Americans for every job opening in December 2007, when the Great Recession began, data recently released by the Department of Labor show that as of October 2011, there were over 4.3 unemployed Americans for every job opening. And whereas data recently released by the Department of Labor show that as of October 2011, there were 3.3 million job openings, which is well below the 4.8 million job openings in March 2007, when job openings were at their highest point during the most recent business cycle. And whereas recent data demonstrate that most unemployed Americans no longer receive unemployment insurance benefits, reflecting the crisis that exists for the millions of Americans who have exhausted their benefits and still cannot find work, including the 100,000 Illinoisans estimated to have exhausted their benefits in 2010, and the additional 100,000 Illinoisans who it is estimated would exhaust their benefits in 2012 if current law were extended. And whereas unemployment benefits are a critical lifeline for our citizens and our economy, including by keeping 3.2 million Americans, including nearly 1 million children, from falling into poverty in 2010 alone, generating $2 in economic stimulus for every $1 the federal government spent during the recession, and saving or creating 1 million jobs as of the fourth quarter of 2009. And whereas all members of the House of Representatives have a responsibility to protect Americans and our country from physical and economic harm, especially during times of national crisis. And whereas the recently introduced Republican proposal to address the unemployment crisis facing our nation fails to protect Americans by drastically cutting 40 weeks of unemployment assistance and imposing new restrictions that would make it more difficult and costly for employees to receive the benefits for which they have paid. Whereas the Republican proposal fails to protect Americans by cutting the number of federally funded weeks of unemployment benefits from 73 to 33 in high unemployment states, abandoning over 1 million Americans in 2012 by slashing their benefits. And whereas the Republican proposal would likely result in the following states with elevated unemployment rates losing 40 weeks of unemployment benefits in 2012: Alabama, California, Connecticut, the District of Columbia, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Idaho, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, Missouri, Nevada, New Jersey, North Carolina, Ohio, Oregon, Rhode Island, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Washington. And whereas the Republican proposal would cause all other states to lose between 14 and 34 weeks of federal unemployment benefits, whereas the Republican proposal would erode the unemployment safety net by undermining the requirement that unemployment dollars fund unemployment benefits to help individual workers cover basic necessities such as food and housing. And whereas the Republican proposal would further erode the unemployment safety net by undermining the eligibility standards that unemployment benefits be determined solely on the basis of a claimant's unemployment. And whereas the Republican proposal demands untested punitive measures that hurt unemployed workers, including deducting money from one's unemployment check to pay for required reemployment assessments and delayed or prohibited benefits depending on educational attainment. And whereas the Republican proposal would disproportionately harm groups of Americans who are hardest hit by unemployment and long-term employment, including older Americans, low-income Americans, Americans from racial and ethnic minority groups, and Americans without a high school diploma. Whereas now that emergency assistance is about to expire, the Republican proposal reflects comfort with $180 billion in tax breaks for the wealthiest 3% of Americans for 2012, but not the $50 billion needed to help millions of the neediest Americans who still cannot find a job. And whereas the Economic Policy Institute estimates that the Republican proposal would result in as much as $22 billion in lost economic growth, and the Center for American Progress estimates that the Republican proposal would lead to a loss of approximately 275,000 jobs in 2012. And whereas it will tarnish the dignity and integrity of the House proceedings if the House considers a bill that cuts critical emergency assistance to millions of Americans, hinders economic recovery, and disproportionately harms older Americans, Americans from racial and ethnic minority groups, low-income Americans, and Americans without a high school degree. Whereas it will tarnish the dignity and integrity of the proceedings if the Republican leadership holds hostage the 2.5 million Americans who the Department of Labor estimate will lose their benefits by March 2012 if Congress fails to act in order to push a radical agenda for the American that they have already rejected. And whereas failure to allow consideration of amendments to protect vulnerable Americans during consideration of a bill that substantially and permanently changes federal unemployment benefits tarnishes the integrity of the legislative process, now therefore be it resolved that the House of Representatives recognizes the immediate need to extend current emergency unemployment benefits to promote our nation's economic recovery by stimulating purchases, creating jobs, and preventing the loss of jobs. Be it further resolved that it recognizes the immediate need to extend current emergency unemployment benefits to help the approximately 6 million unemployed Americans who will lose benefits if current emergency unemployment benefits are not extended through 2012. Be it further resolved that it disapproves of drastically limited federal unemployment benefits until economic growth is robust and the nation is in a period of full employment, and it calls on the leadership of the House to bring a vote to a clean extension of all current emergency unemployment benefits for a full year to protect the millions of Americans who will lose benefits if the current statute sunsets at the end of December 2011, or if H.R. 3630, as posted by the Committee on Rules on December 9, 2011, is enacted.
Entertain the resolution. Does the gentleman from Illinois wish to offer it at this point?
Yes, I do.
Clerk will report the resolution.